Good morning. Thank you for joining us as we consider the fiscal year 2012 budget request for the Department of the Army. Secretary McHugh, General Casey, thank you both for being here. As I've said before, we're very fortunate to have both of you serving our country. Secretary McHugh, once again, you find yourself in the hot seat. 9-term member of Congress and this committee's former ranking member. I'm sure glad you moved over there. General Casey says, me too, so that's...
Mr. McKeon, not more than I.
I don't know. Oh.
I guess I should say I'm glad as well, so it's all worked out fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without a doubt, whether a member of this committee or as the 21st Secretary of the Army, you're a staunch advocate for soldiers and their families. We on the Armed Services Committee are very proud of you and of your achievements and the things that you're doing there, and we thank you for your public service. General Casey, you're also no stranger to this committee. I want to take a moment to mention that this will be your last Army posture hearing. 30th Vice Chief of Staff, Commander Multinational Force Iraq, 36th Chief of Staff, over 40 years of selfless military service to this nation. Pretty good for a guy that wasn't going to go in the service. I know you still have much that you want to accomplish in your time as Army Chief of Staff, but I thank you and your wife Sheila for your service to our country, for the leadership that you've provided for our Army, and for all of the soldiers that have served under you during those 40 years and the ones that you served under. Great tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'd like to mention that the ranking member and I recently had the pleasure to visit with soldiers at Fort Lewis in Mr. Smith's district and the National Training Center in my district, along with several members of our committee. While at the NTC, we were able to observe the 3rd Brigade, 25th Infantry Division as they trained for their upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. I want to mention that one of the things that I've been very concerned about is IEDs, and I thought we just weren't doing enough, no matter what we're doing. But I was very impressed, both there and at Fort Lewis, where we observed the 3rd and 4th Stryker Brigade combat teams from the 2nd Infantry Division. Excellent training they were getting to prepare them for IEDs and the things that are being done to interdict get rid of the financer or get rid of the builder, or all the things that are being done. The Marines also, we went to the Mountain Warfare Center in the Sierras and saw them, and it was a great visit. But the soldiers that we saw training were getting excellent training, and I'm sure it will save lives as they arrive in Afghanistan. It's on trips like these and similar trips to Iraq and Afghanistan that we're reminded why hearings such as this one are so important, because you just don't go to war with the Army you have. You go to war with an Army who was resourced, hopefully properly, with personnel and equipment provided by the United States Congress, by the United States people. As our former chairman, the great Ike Skelton, used to say, the buck stops here. I'm sure he wasn't talking about me. To that end, I remain concerned about the reduction of an additional $78 billion from the Department's funding top line, including the $13 billion cut in 2012, ultimately leading to a 0% real growth within 3 years. The Army's share of the Department's efficiency savings is $29 billion, including $2.7 billion in the 2012 budget request. We're told that the Army has been allowed to reinvest all of the $2.7 billion. However, when you compare the Army's base budget and the supplemental budget request from 2011 to 2012, this budget request is almost $30 billion less. I understand that the primary reason for the reduction is based on the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq by this year, by the end of December. Clearly, there was a need to move overseas contingency operations funding into the base budget, but we need assurances that the Army was able to migrate everything they needed from the supplemental into the base. particularly as it relates to taking care of soldiers and the reset of equipment. Likewise, this Congress must learn more about the proposed end-strength reductions for the Army. The Army has borne the brunt of 2 wars for the past decade and hasn't reached its objectives for active component dwell time of 1 to 3. In fact, the proposed end-strength reductions appear to force the Army to settle for only a 1 to 2 dwell time. I'd like to know why. In short, I cannot in good conscience ask the Army to do more with less. Again, I thank both of you for your service to our country and for being here today. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to echo your comments in support of and thanks for our 2 men testifying today. Secretary McHugh, it's a great honor serving with you on this committee for a long time. It's great to have you over there. You certainly understand this committee, and you understand the Pentagon as well. You're in the perfect position. You've been great to work with as Secretary of Army and as a member of the committee, and it's a real asset for our country to have you there. It's great to see you back here today. And General Casey, congratulations on a great term of service to your country. It's been great working with you. I know you will miss these hearings more than anything, but we appreciate your hard work on behalf of the Army. And yes, I say that facetiously, but appreciate the work you do in presenting this. And it's been a great relationship, I believe, between this committee and yourself. You've always done a great job of reaching out to individual members, making sure that we're informed, and giving us a chance to understand the issues that are so important. So you will be missed, and we appreciate your great service to your country. And also, as I said, your work with this committee specifically has been outstanding, and I've appreciated it, as I know other members have as well. And as we go forward into this posture hearing, there are a lot of transitions coming. As the Chairman mentioned, there's talk about what the future force structure should be as drawdowns continue in Iraq and hopefully at some point begin to happen in Afghanistan. What does that mean for the Army? But I want to assure you and all those listening that this committee still remains focused on the fact that your Army is in the fight, and protecting those who are in the fight is our top priority. We still have 50,000 troops overall in Iraq, and in Afghanistan we still have 100,000, and they are in many cases in the midst of a very difficult fight. And this committee's top priority is to make sure that they are equipped and have the support that they need to prosecute that fight to the best of their ability. The Chairman mentioned what is our top priority, and that is IEDs. Still causes the most casualties over there, and I do want to also compliment both of you for the work you've done. Every Army base that I've been to, they take you in the IED training, and they are every day learning directly from what's happening over there, taking it back, training the soldiers so that they will be best prepared when they get over there to deal with that threat. It's a constantly evolving threat, but you're evolving with it in a way that has unquestionably saved lives of our soldiers. So we appreciate that work, and this committee will again ask anything we can do to help in that area we want to do. We know how important it is. And then the major challenge going forward is the transition. As we get back, as we begin to draw down, what does that mean for the size of the force? I think the Chairman asks the appropriate questions. What is the mission set that's going to be asked of our soldiers, and is the force the proper size to meet that? How do we get back into a more regular training mission, training for all of the threats that come at us instead of just sort of responding as quickly as we have to the immediate threats now? What should that look like? It's not easy to tell. How do we get the dwell times back up so we can deal with some of the stress on the force that I know, General Casey, you have talked about a great deal? Those are questions we need to answer, and we look forward to hearing from you today on how we should go about meeting those threats. In particular, we're also focused on PTSD and traumatic brain injury, some of the things that have more long-term impacts. How are we preparing to do that? And I will say that when I was down at Fort Hood a few weeks ago, I was very impressed with the overall preparation for how you deal with the stresses and strains on the force. I think you're making a great deal of progress on that, and look forward to being as supportive as we possibly can. And lastly is the modernization of the force. I know we had some significant struggles with the future combat systems, which I believe we are pulling our way out of, and I thank both of you for your leadership on that. We do need to update, modernize, and better equip our infantry brigades. The core of that is the network. How do we make sure that the soldiers get the information when they need it? How can we give them total situational awareness? You have to have the proper network to do that. I think we've learned a lot of hard lessons in the acquisition process about how to do that better, how to acquire equipment in the future, hopefully in a more cost-effective manner that gets there more quickly. But I believe we are making progress on that. I thank both of you. Also, I thank General Corelli, who I've worked with very closely on some of these issues, for making that progress. Look forward to continuing to support that effort, because unquestionably, information warfare places a great deal more challenges on all of our services, but on the Army in particular, to make sure they have the best equipment when they need it. You can't go through a 2-year, the normal acquisition process in some cases, to make sure you have that equipment, because by the time you get to the end of it, it's already 2 or 3 years out of date. So we've learned some good lessons there. I think we're making progress. And again, I look forward to working with you, and this committee, as always, stands ready to support you in any way that we can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The Honorable John McHugh, Secretary of the Army, and General George W. Casey, Chief of Staff, U.S. Army. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of, from a somewhat prejudiced view, what I believe is certainly the leading committee in the United States House of Representatives. It's great to be back here, although I enjoyed the view sitting up there looking down here better. It's terrific to see so many not old but long-standing friends and colleagues, and to see so many new members here who have stepped forward to serve on this great committee, and I commend them for that action and look forward to working with them as well. I should note on a sad comment, it pains all of us, I know, that Congresswoman Gabby Giffords is not with us here today. I have to tell you from my experience working with her, she was one of the most determined and capable legislators in the House, but really a tireless champion for the men and women who wore the uniform of this nation. And in fact, she was one of the first members of Congress to call me after I had been confirmed into this post, and she offered her congratulations, but she just happened to take the opportunity to talk about the great men and women at Fort Huachuca, which is in her district, of course. And I remember thinking very clearly that that's Gabby, always taking the opportunity to look out for soldiers and their families. And certainly everyone in the Army family joins me in wishing her a speedy recovery, and we look forward to seeing her back in her rightful place in this distinguished committee. And our thoughts and prayers go out as well to those other innocent victims of that tragic day, and may they quickly find peace and comfort in the days ahead. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to join with you in recognizing this great soldier on my left. As you mentioned, this is the last time, at least he hopes it's the last time, that he'll appear before this committee as the chair of the Chief of Staff of our great Army. And it's a career that's spanned 4 distinguished decades, and he's held numerous positions at every level, but one thing has remained constant through all of those positions. He has done the right thing by our soldiers and their families. He's had a tireless determination to serve our nation. And I can tell you that over the last nearly 18 months, George and I have not only operated as partners, but I think we've become close friends, in spite of the fact that he's a Boston Red Sox fan. So I do look forward to working with another exceptional leader, the presidential nominee, General Marty Dempsey, should the Senate so concur. But the Army, this nation, and I will truly miss George and Sheila. They're great Americans. I want to thank—
I thought you were going to propose I get constructive credit for the hearing.
No, I wasn't, but nice try. I want to thank each of you for your steadfast support of our 1.1 million soldiers, 279,000 civilians and their families. With the leadership and great support of this Congress, and particularly this committee, America's Army continues to be at the forefront of combat, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and security assistance operations in nearly 80 countries around the world. In Iraq, our soldiers and civilians began one of the largest and most complex logistical operations in our nation's history. As we continue to draw down our forces to meet the December 31, 2011 deadline, we've already closed or transferred over 80% of the bases that we maintain to the Iraqi authorities. We've reduced the number of U.S. personnel by over 75,000, and we've redeployed some 26,000 vehicles back to other operations. Having recently visited Iraq for my 16th time just last January, I can validate firsthand the true enormity of the retrograde operations and the exceptionally high morale of the forces remaining as they continue to advise, assist, and train Iraqis to support that still burgeoning democracy. Simultaneous with the drawdown operations, the Army has surged an additional 30,000 soldiers to Afghanistan to defeat the al-Qaeda terrorist network and the Taliban insurgency. This surge enabled our soldiers and our Afghan partners to seize multiple sanctuaries in the traditional insurgent heartland of southern Afghanistan. Additionally, during this past year, our forces have trained some 109,000 Afghan National Army soldiers, as well as 41,000 Afghan National Police. Yet, overseas contingency operations are only one part of the Army's diverse requirements. Our soldiers and civilians from all Army components remain committed to protecting our homeland not only from the threat of enemies who would harm us, but also from the ravages of natural and man-made disasters. From National Guard soldiers assisting with drug enforcement and border security to the Army Corps of Engineers responding to the catastrophic oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, America's Army has been there to support local, state, and federal partners in saving, protecting, and caring for our citizens. Clearly, over the last year, America's Army has seen extraordinary success in one of the most dynamic, dangerous, and complex operational environments in our nation's history. Yet our challenges have not been reserved solely for combat, border protection, or disaster relief. For just as our soldiers and civilians conducted multiple operations here and around the world, the Army simultaneously continued its far-reaching efforts to modernize equipment, transform units, and complete the unprecedented consolidations required under the round of base closure and realignment. As the Army continues to fight global terrorists and regional insurgents, we must be ever mindful of the future and future enemies, such as hybrid threats and hostile state actors that we may well face. It's vital, therefore, that we have a modernization program, one that provides our soldiers with a full array of equipment necessary to maintain a decisive advantage over the enemies we are fighting today, and to also ensure that we can deter and defeat tomorrow's threats at a price that we can afford. Our fiscal year 12 budget request is critical to achieving this goal by supporting the extraordinary strides being made in the Army's state-of-the-art network, tactical wheeled vehicle, and combat vehicle modernization programs. Regarding the network, we're requesting $974 million in procurement and $298 million in research and development for the Warfighter Information Network Tactical, WIN-T, which will become the cornerstone of our battlefield communication systems, as the distinguished ranking member had mentioned. This budget request also contains $2.1 billion in procurement for joint and combat communication systems, including the Joint Tactical Radio System, that are known as JTRS. As we look to modernize our wheeled and combat vehicle fleets, we're asking for $1.5 billion for tactical wheeled vehicle modernization, and $1.04 billion in support of the Army's combat vehicle modernization strategy, including $884 million for the ground combat vehicle and $156 million for the modernization of the Stryker, Bradley, and Abrams programs. Along with advances in equipment, the Army is seeking new methods to use and secure our scarce energy resources. Clearly, future operations will depend on our ability to reduce dependency, increase efficiency, and use more renewable or alternative sources of energy. We've made great strides in this area, and we intend to do more. The Army has established a Senior Energy Council, appointed a Senior Energy Executive, created an Energy Security Office, and adopted a comprehensive strategy for energy security. Based on this strategy, we're developing more efficient generators and power distribution platforms, factoring in fuel costs as a part of equipment modernizations, and developing a net zero approach to holistically address our installation's energy, water, and waste needs. In May 2010, the Chief and I commissioned an unprecedented blue ribbon panel review of the Army's acquisition systems from cradle to grave. We're currently reviewing the panel's insightful report, and we'll use it as a guide over the next 2 years to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the Army acquisition process. But we didn't stop there. To ensure that we purchase the right equipment to meet the needs of our soldiers, we instituted a series of capability portfolio reviews to examine all existing Army requirements and terminate programs that we judged to be redundant, didn't work, or which are just too expensive. These broad-based reviews have already helped us to identify key gaps and unnecessary redundancies while promoting good stewardship of our nation's resources. We remain committed to using every effort to obtain the right systems, supplies, and services at the right time and in the most cost-effective, streamlined manner. Our soldiers and the taxpayers deserve no less. We look forward to working closely with this committee as we continue to implement these sweeping challenges. Throughout it all, at its heart, the Army is people. Although our soldiers and civilians are better trained, led, and equipped, and more capable than ever before, our forces are clearly stretched and our personnel are strained from a decade of war. This is evidenced by yet another year of discouraging rates of suicide and high-risk behavior, not only among members of the regular Army, but the reserve components as well. In response, under the direct supervision of our Vice Chief of Staff, General Pete Corelli, the Army completed an unprecedented 15-month study to better understand suicide and related actions amongst our soldiers. In July, we published the first-ever Health Promotion, Risk Reduction, and Suicide Prevention Report, a very, very candid assessment designed to assist our leaders in recognizing and reducing high-risk behavior, as well as the stigma associated with behavioral health care. The lessons from this holistic review have been infused into every level of command and incorporated throughout our efforts to strengthen the resiliency of our soldiers, families, and civilians. Moreover, our fiscal year 12 budget requests $1.7 billion to fund vital soldier and family programs to provide the full range of essential services to include Army campaign for health promotion, risk reduction, and suicide prevention, sexual harassment and assault response and prevention, and comprehensive soldier fitness. In addition, this funding supports family services including morale, welfare, and recreation programs, youth services, and child care. Survivor outreach services and education and employment opportunities for family members are funded in this manner as well. Yet caring for our personnel and their families goes beyond mental, physical, and emotional health. We're also committed to protecting their safety both at home and abroad from internal and external threats. As part of our continuing efforts to learn and adapt from the Fort Hood shooting, the Army has instituted a number of key programs to enhance awareness, reporting, prevention, and response to such threats. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the devastating impact of the continuing resolution on each of the programs I have mentioned, as well as dozens of others. From modernization of MILCON to family services and base operations support, the lack of a fiscal year 11 budget is adversely affecting critical needs and projects that support our soldiers and their families, not to mention delaying long-term requirements of the Department writ large. Let me close by mentioning my deep appreciation and admiration for all those who wear the Army uniform, as well as the great civilians who work day in and day out to support them. Daily, I'm reminded that these heroes make enormous sacrifices in defense of the nation, sacrifices that simply can't be measured accurately. Moreover, I know that each of you, as members of this great committee, plays a key role in the success of that Army. Your efforts and your support ensure that our soldiers, civilians, and Army families receive the critical resources and authorities they need. We cannot do it without you. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today, and I look forward to the rest of the hearing. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General?
Thank you, Chairman. Congressman Smith, members of the committee. I'm trying to keep a straight face, but being here for the last time is not all it's cut out to be, I'll just tell you that. But it is a great opportunity for me to talk to you about the progress that we have made in the Army over the last decade. I would echo Secretary's comments on Congresswoman Giffords and add my wishes for her speedy recovery and a return to this chamber. And if you would indulge me, Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce some guests here today who represent the men and women of this great Army. First of all, if you just stand up there if you would, Ruth. Ruth Stonecipher, Ruth's son, Christopher, was killed in a helicopter crash along the Afghan-Pakistan border in 2001, and Ruth has committed herself since to helping other surviving spouses. She's recently completed a tour as the director of the Gold Star Mothers Foundation for the last year. So thank you very much, Ruth. Sitting next to her is First Sergeant Damian Anderson. He's the First Sergeant from the Old Guard, but he has recently completed a 10-day Master Resilience Trainer course at the University of Pennsylvania. And Master Resilience Trainers are part of our key program to give our soldiers, civilians, and family members the skills they need to deal with the coming challenges of the next decade. So thank you very much, First Sergeant. And lastly, Sergeant Joel Dulashante. In 2007, Sergeant Dulashante was severely wounded and lost his right leg. He's been working actually here in our legislative liaison office while he's been completing a 2-year recovery. The good news is he's completed that recovery, and he'll leave this summer to go to our airborne school as a member of the cadre down at Fort Benning, Georgia. So thank you very much. Now, if I may, Mr. Chairman, for the past 4 years, you've heard me say that the Army was out of balance, that we were so weighed down by our current commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan that we couldn't do the things that we knew we needed to do to sustain this all-volunteer force for the long haul and to prepare to do other things. Today, thanks in large measure to the sustained support from this committee, I can tell you that we have made great progress toward the goals that we set for ourselves in 2007, and as an Army, we're starting to breathe again. We're emerging from a decade of war and transformation with a well-equipped, combat-seasoned, total force that, while still stretched by the demands and lingering effects of a decade at war, is able to begin preparing for the challenges of the second decade of the 21st century. And let me just quickly update you on some of that progress. First, we've completed both the permanent end strength increase that was directed by President Bush in 2007 and the temporary end strength increase of 22,000 authorized by Secretary Gates in 2009. This allowed us to meet the plus-up in Afghanistan before we departed Iraq without having to increase deployed time for our soldiers. I know there's a concern about the condition-based reductions planned in our end strength that were announced by Secretary Gates a few weeks ago. But I can tell you that I believe that if the drawdowns in Iraq and Afghanistan go as planned, that it is prudent to begin planning to reduce the size of the Army in 2015. And we need to do that to facilitate sustaining a balanced force, one that is both the right size to meet our national security strategy at an appropriate deployment tempo, but that is also well-trained, well-equipped, and well-supported. In a time of war, we just can't afford anything less. Second, our growth plus the drawdown in Iraq enable us to significantly improve dwell. And by dwell, I mean the time at home between deployments. This is a critical component of sustaining an all-volunteer force in a protracted conflict. For the better part of 5 years, we were returning soldiers to combat after only 1 year at home. And we knew that wasn't sustainable and have been working to bring dwell to 2 years at home as quickly as possible. I will tell you that beginning the 1st of October this year, given what we know about the projected demands, our active units who deploy after the 1st of October will deploy with an expectation of having 2 years at home when they return. Our Guard and Reserve units will deploy with an expectation of having 4 years at home when they return. We have worked very hard to get to this point, and it's a significant accomplishment, because all of our studies tell us that it takes 24 to 36 months to recover from a 1-year combat deployment. It just does. We're human beings. And turning faster than that accelerates the cumulative effects. I would tell you that we will continue to work toward our long-term goal of 3 years at home between combat deployments. Third, this year we will also largely complete the largest organizational transformation of the Army since World War II. We'll finish the modular conversion of all but a handful of our 300 brigades and finish rebalancing soldiers out of Cold War skills into skills that are more relevant and more necessary today. That's to the tune of about 150,000 to 160,000 soldiers. Taken together, it's a fundamentally different Army than it was on September 11, 2001. And we had a great Army then. But today, we're a much more versatile and experienced force. Fourth, to enhance this versatility, we've developed a fundamentally different way of building readiness and providing trained and ready forces to combatant commander. And I think you've heard about it, but we call it the Army Force Generation Model. It's an output-based readiness model that fully integrates the Guard and Reserve, that brings the kind of predictability we need to sustain our all-volunteer force, and that allows us to build the readiness we need to both meet current demands and to hedge against unexpected contingencies. R4Gen is also a more effective and more efficient way of building the readiness we need when we need it. So if you add all these things up, accelerated growth, increased dwell, transformation, and the R4Gen readiness model, together they begin to allow us to restore some strategic flexibility, the capability to provide trained and ready forces to all combatant commanders for operations across the spectrum of conflict. So after a decade of very hard work, we have a force that's the right size, that is organized in versatile modular formations on a predictable rotational cycle, that has sufficient time at home to begin training for the full range of missions and to recover from a decade at war. This would not have been possible without your support and the support of the American people. So thank you. Now, this fiscal year 12 budget marks a transition point in which we can begin shifting our focus from restoring balance to sustaining the balance that we together have so painstakingly restored to this force. Sustaining that balance is critically important because this war is not over by any stretch of the imagination. The fiscal year 12 budget that we're presenting today enables us to maintain our combat edge, to reset and reconstitute our force, to continue to deal with the impacts of a decade at war, and to build the resilience into this force for the second decade. I'd like to say a few words about each of those, but in short, this budget enables us to sustain the balance that we have restored to this great Army. First, maintaining our combat edge. It's important that we maintain the edge that we've honed over a decade at war, and we'll do that through continuous adaptation, affordable modernization, tough, demanding training for the full range of missions, and by sustaining the gains that we've made in our reserve components. Last week, Secretary Gates said that we were an institution transformed by war. He's absolutely right, and I talked about that transformation a few minutes ago. But I believe that we are in a period of continuous and fundamental change driven by rapid technological advances and adaptive enemies. Critical to our ability to maintain our edge will be an affordable modernization strategy that provides the equipment that gives our soldiers a decisive advantage over any enemy that they face. This budget lays out such a plan, and I'd like just to highlight two key areas and reinforce what the Secretary said. No matter where our soldiers are operating, they need to know where they are, they need to know where their buddies are, they need to know where the enemy is, and when they shoot at the enemy, they need to strike them with precision. They'll also need protected mobility. This budget contains funding that will begin the fielding of some key elements of the network that will enable our soldiers in any environment. And these include the Joint Tactical Radio System and the Warfighter Information Network. It also includes funding for a new ground combat vehicle that provides protection against IEDs, that has the capacity to carry a 9-man squad, and is capable of operating across the spectrum of operations. And we also hope that it can be developed in 7 years. Maintaining our combat edge also requires training for the full spectrum of operations. This training is conducted both at home station and at our combat training centers, and it will be critical to ensuring that we sustain our combat experience and restore the ability to rapidly deploy for the full range of missions. It will require moving operations and maintenance dollars from OCO to the base over the next several years. It will also be important to consolidate the gains that we made in our reserve components. Think about it. Half of our guardsmen and reservists are combat veterans. Half of the general officers in the Guard and Reserve are combat veterans. I've never seen the relationship between the active and reserve component forces better than it is now. And we're working together to establish an effective paradigm that allows us to leverage our substantial investments and the substantial experience of the reserve components. Second point, reconstituting the force. I see two elements to this. One is the continuous reset of forces returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. We've got over 110,000 soldiers there today, and they and their replacements and their equipment will need to be reset over time. Reset isn't a one-time shot. It's a process that's necessary for every returning unit, and it will require sustained funding for 2 to 3 years after we're out of Iraq and Afghanistan to ensure that we reconstitute the force fully and restore readiness into our next to deploy forces. We haven't had that ability in 5 or 6 years, and so it's important that we restore that readiness. The third critical element for us is building resilience into the force for the long haul. We've been at war for almost a decade. The cumulative effects are still with us, and they're going to be with us for a while. Think about it. More than 4,000 soldiers killed, leaving some more than 20,000 family members. Over 29,000 soldiers wounded, 8,000 of them significantly enough to require long-term care. Over 100,000 soldiers diagnosed with traumatic brain injury. Fortunately, greater than 90% are moderate or mild. 40,000 soldiers diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, and over 30,000 soldiers processed through our warrior transition units. This budget contains funding for programs like the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness, Health Promotion, Risk Reduction and Suicide Prevention, the Army Family Covenant, Survivor Outreach Services, and Sexual Assault Prevention that will allow us to continue to build resilience into this force for the second decade. We remain, as I know you do, committed to the well-being of our soldiers, families, and civilians. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to leave the committee with two thoughts as I complete over 40 years of service to this great country. First, we're at a key transition point here as we move from a decade of war and transformation to a decade of sustaining a force at war in a period of declining resources. Together, we have built a great Army, but it's an Army still stretched and recovering from the last decade of war, and it continues to prosecute a war in 2 theaters. It took us a decade to get where we are today. And we recognize that the country is in a difficult fiscal position, and we have and will continue to work hard to use the resources that you provide us as effectively and as efficiently as possible. But we are at war, and this war is not over. So we need to proceed with caution, because the last thing any of us want to do is to create a hollow army while we're fighting a war. And second, Mr. Chairman, is to thank the members of this committee for your enduring support of our Army. You visited our troops and their families at home and in war. You've helped us bury our dead, and you've seen firsthand, through all this change, hardship, and demands of war, what has remained constant is the courage, the selfless service, and the sacrifice of our soldiers, our families, and our Army civilians. I couldn't be more proud to have worn this uniform for the past 40 years and to have served alongside the men and women of this great Army. I'm humbled and particularly proud to have led them in this last decade. It's been the greatest honor of my career. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much. General Casey, I'm just a couple of things about the end strength. I'd like to understand the relationship between the current requirement for BCTs and the cut to the end strength of 27,000 soldiers. Did the Army propose the cut, or was it imposed on the Army? If it was the result of an in-depth Army analysis, I'd like to hear when that analysis took place and what the results were. If the analysis has not yet taken place, does the Army have assurances that the Department of Defense will restore the funding required if the analysis suggests a lesser reduction is appropriate?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. First of all, we did not propose the cuts. They were given to us from the Department of Defense. We were informed of them before they were announced, but we did not participate in the development. But last July, I went to the Secretary of Defense, and I laid out for him what I thought the Army needed to do in the next 5 years. And the majority of that was in the next 3 years to get this force back and to reset it and reconstitute it. And I told them that to do that, I needed to hold the end strength of the Army and the access to the Guard and Reserve constant through fiscal year 14. And he basically supported me in that with this decision. Now, as I said in my testimony, I see this end strength reduction as condition-based, and the Secretary established those conditions. If the assumptions don't hold, then I'm sure the Secretary and my successor will feel very comfortable coming back to the Secretary and saying, this won't work. But I think it's important that as we look at this, to remember that we need a balanced Army coming out the other end. And if we hold the end strength too high, we run the risk of having a big hollow force, like the Army I came into. So it's going to take some good analysis and some good interaction between the committee and us as we go forward, that we come out of this with the right size Army that can meet demands at an appropriate tempo and is also well-equipped, well-trained, and well-maintained. John, you want to?
If I may, Mr. Chairman, first of all, I associate myself with the comments of the Chief. While we didn't participate, certainly from my perspective, we were given ample opportunity to come in and to talk to both the programmers and the Secretary as to the way ahead. And from my perspective, as I look at the direction we are on a path to take, both with respect to a total drawdown in Iraq at the end of this calendar year, and the way forward that the President has laid down in his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief and beginning to withdraw out of Afghanistan in numbers yet to be determined beginning in 2014, this is a supportable position, and the budget that underpins it is appropriately arrayed, particularly, as the Chief said, with respect to ensuring that we have an end strike number that is supported robustly by the kinds of training, equipment, and support programs that are necessary to keep it from being hollow, something that some of the older amongst us in this room had gone through before in our oversight role, and something we very much want to resist, and both Secretary of Defense and the President are ever mindful of that. The old adage, man plans, God laughs, is always true. I remember in my role early on and listening to 4 administrations come to this committee and lay out their 5-year programs, I told them I just pray to God someday before I die I'm allowed to live in an out year. I mean, as the President has said, and as the Secretary endorsed in his comments at West Point just last week, we are perfect in our record of prediction. We've always been wrong. So the Secretary, the administration, and I assure you, Mr. Chairman, I recognize that we have to be ever vigilant as to the changing realities and demand on the force. But as we look ahead to 2015 and 2016, this is a very supportable and I think a very justifiable position.
Thank you very much. I know we're all concerned that, and as you both stated, no one can see really over the horizon. We have to put our best guesses, and as you said, unfortunately, many times we're wrong. But our job, I think, all of us working together, is to make sure that we're not wrong at the detriment to the nation. And I know I've been around long enough to remember how we cut back after World War II and after Korea and after Vietnam, and I just want to make sure that we don't put ourselves in a position that we, as Reagan said, we don't, he never saw us get into war because we were over-prepared. And that's a fine line, I think, between a hollowed-out Army and one that is lean and mean and ready to go and sufficient in size to handle all of those eventualities that may hit us. You mentioned, both of you, the CR, and I know we all have strong concerns there, and I think all of the committee here is unanimous in understanding and supporting the prospect of getting an appropriation bill finished up. And I've talked to the appropriators, and they've assured me that they're ready to go. They've got the bill done. I don't know how much it has been coordinated yet at this point with the Senate. I know they've been working on it. I was hopeful that we would be able to tie it in to this CR that's being voted on this week, but apparently there wasn't time to get it all done. But maybe, hopefully, it could be done at the end of this 2-week extension that we're voting on this week, because everybody, you've all expressed it, all of the services, Secretary has expressed it, industry, everybody understands that if we don't get this done, stupid things are going to happen, and it's going to end up costing us more money. So we're unanimous in desire. It's just if we're going to be able to pull it together and make it happen, and I feel fairly confident that we will. The rest of the spending will probably just roll into one big omnibus bill to carry through September 30th, but defense will be hopefully separated out and should be able to move us forward. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I share the Chairman's concerns about the CR and the hope that we get there. I am a little less optimistic about the ultimate outcome, and I think the members of this committee in particular should bear close scrutiny on that process and be as supportive as possible of getting us a defense appropriations bill once we get through this whole process. There are still a lot of differences between the House and the Senate to resolve to get there, and if we don't get there, one of the consequences is the impact that it has on, certainly on the Army, on the entire DOD. So getting a defense appropriations bill, getting a process that gets us to September 30th is critically important to what everybody on this committee does, and I hope we all work hard in the next couple of weeks to try and make sure that we get that done. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your kind words about Congresswoman Giffords. One of the things that her staff has been doing, you'll be interested to know, she and her staff continue to be incredibly strong advocates for Fort Huachuca, in particular, in the military in particular, and they've worked closely with my staff to make sure that while she's recovering, her questions and concerns about the military and about her district in particular get addressed. So I have a couple questions from her staff that have been sent to me, and then a couple of my own. Fort Huachuca is a critical part of the Army. I've been down there to visit myself, going back at the end of this month. As a matter of fact, it's where the Intelligence Center of Excellence is, which provides great support for all the intel operations and the training for our intel officers. It's also where the Army's Network Enterprise Technology Command, or NETCOM, is, and that's the focus of my first question. How are you in the Army doing a better job of protecting our networks? Obviously, in light of the whole WikiLeaks thing, there have been heightened concerns, but even before that, we're aware of the challenges of protecting the Army's network and also protecting the entire DOD network, because they all come in together. And one of the things I've discovered as I visit military bases, there are a lot of different Army bases that have a piece of that responsibility, and it's never been clear to me who is ultimately responsible for network security. It is a multi-layered thing, but having ultimate responsibility is a good place to start. How are you pulling that together? What is your overall plan for the Army's network security?
I would just start, and anything the Chief wants to add. Obviously, you mentioned WikiLeaks, Mr. Smith. You're absolutely right. That was a real lessons learned for us, and in fact for DoD writ large. We really had a parallel effort at OSD and DoD level. Their intelligence folks have taken a hard look at the processes and the procedures as to network protection. They have ordered a host of reforms and new measures, including the tighter restrictions on readable media, et cetera, that have already been implemented. And while I can't put a quantified number to it, I think we've already come a long way in ensuring that our network security systems, particularly for the kinds of things that happen with respect to WikiLeaks, does not happen again. Beyond that, at the Army level, we're coordinating, of course, with OSD, but we've stood up our cyber, which in concert with Cyber Command, General Keith Alexander is the combatant commander, working together to ensure that we're installing the kinds of network protections across the Army, across the services in general, are taken up. The Secretary also asked me to go and to take a hard look at what happened in WikiLeaks, not just what happened at that particular SCIF, but the processes by which we train, the processes by which we maintain security, both at home, but of course in theater as well.
Basic question, if I could, on that,
Certainly.
Mr. Secretary. One of the big concerns that was raised was the fact that this material was able to be downloaded and there was no alarm bells that went off. This was clearly protected. Maybe just could you answer why? Why was there not a situation where if this was downloaded, it didn't, raise an alarm?
Well, the study is still ongoing, but I think there were a couple of reasons. One, the controls on the SCIF were not up to standards.
So it was the Army's policy that should have happened. It just didn't. It wasn't a policy.
I don't want to suggest to you we don't have room for improvement, because
Okay.
I think it's going to come back that we do. And in fact, I'm going to meet with General Caslin. He's the officer who's the commander of our schoolhouse out at Fort Leavenworth, to pull together a team to look at that. I think we probably have a situation where we need to tighten up both our training and our standards, but it seems likely to me that where procedures did exist, where they were perhaps not as sufficient as we'd like, they probably were not upheld as well as they should have been.
And just one other specific question on that. You mentioned the Cyber Command. I think that's a great step. I'm a big fan of General Alexander's. Could not have a better person in that position. So you are confident now that in terms of who is ultimately responsible for network security within the Army, that will filter up directly through the Cyber Command. Army has a representative there, and that representative is going to be the person who every day wakes up going, it's my responsibility to make sure the network is protected.
That's the purpose of those two commands, and I share your great admiration for General Alexander, his experience at NSA, and now carried into Cyber Command. I think will give us the kind of one source authority that's necessary to make sure all the services are pulling the oar in the same direction.
Okay, if I could move on to the other area, as you know, Congresswoman Giffords is very interested in energy security, alternatives, efficiencies, dealing with the energy challenges. There's a great quote in your written testimony. The Army's logistical tail of the operational energy pipeline is a handicap that must be overcome through technological advances. Fancy way of saying getting energy to the troops is always a major challenge. There have been examples. The Marine Corps has a forward operating base that has used solar to dramatically reduce the amount of fuel that they have to use, which has dramatically reduced the number of convoys that need to run that fuel in and out, always at risk when you're running a convoy. So it's definitely been saving lives and different to saving energy. Two questions about that. I also know that you have set up a sort of a tech center at Bagram, which has a long, complicated name that I won't get into. But basically, it's the problem solver. If you have a technological problem anywhere, across the Army, the tech center is the place to go. Energy, obviously, is going to be one of those technological challenges. How is the Army meeting those operational challenges and trying to reduce its dependency on energy and more deal with the challenges that were laid out there?
Well, I just call it the technology village at Bagram. Okay. It's much easier than the longer term. But as you stated very correctly, Congressman, that is the place where we bring in and fuse together the various elements of energy efficiency and of energy consumption reduction that we think is so very important. It's a big cost saver. There's no question about it. But frankly, at least from my perspective, we look at this as a matter of soldier safety. Convoying in fuel supplies is a very dangerous job, and we'd like to see that reduced as greatly as possible. We have already deployed some of the lessons learned in places like Fort Huachuca and places like Fort Irwin and National Training Center with respect to fuel cells, with respect to water purification systems. We're putting into the field higher efficiency generators. I would add as well that we have put a mark on the wall that we expect in the years ahead that will reduce our energy consumption at FOBs through high efficiency batteries, et cetera, by 30 to 60%. So the Marines and us and the Army are working hard to reduce that as a cost saver, but as I said, as a saver of lives, and we're very devoted and dedicated to that objective.
All right, thank you. I won't ask for a comment on this. I just want to make a statement for the record. One of the big problems we have within Department of Defense is the contractor issue, which you remember from when you were here, the excessive reliance on them, the amount of cost. We have contractors, supervisors, and contractors in some instances, which drives up costs as well. That's something this committee is going to be taking a close look at as we try to find efficiencies. I would be curious to get, for the record, an answer, sort of both of your take, not right now, but if you could submit something on how we are addressing that problem. How can we save money in the contractor world? Because that's something that many members of this committee are interested in. So we can do that for the record. If you had a quick comment, I had one other thing I wanted to ask.
I have a quick comment.
Go ahead.
And I'm glad you brought it up because this is, in our opinion, a place where we can save a lot of taxpayer dollars through common sense and a tighter rein. As I mentioned in my opening comments, we commissioned a blue ribbon panel. They've come back with, I think, some very exciting recommendations as to how we can tighten that up. I've asked both the Deputy Undersecretary of the Army and the Acquisition Executive to look at that, to come back to the Chief and I with recommendations. The other thing, just in closing, one of the bigger problems we've had in theater is we didn't have enough corps, contracting officer representatives. In fact, in 2007, we just had 200. Now I'm proud to say we've grown that corps body to 3,558. And that gives us a on-the-ground eyeball on the kinds of contract situations where we've not been as efficient as we should, and we've not run as tight a ship as we could, and we're getting better. But clearly, we look forward to working with you and doing an even better job, sir.
Yeah, I will certainly take a closer look at that report and look forward to working with you on that. The final question I have builds off of Secretary Gates' speech at West Point. He called into question the size of the Army's heavy mechanized forces given the threats he foresees in the future. His most quotable line from the speech being, you'd have to be insane to go into a war like we went into Iraq and Afghanistan anytime again in the future. Some people have misunderstood that as a criticism of the existing fights that we're in. But I think it's looking forward to say, what are our needs? And I think your initial requests in the budget this year, focus on helicopters, network communications, lighter, faster, dealing with the asymmetric threats. But at the same time, there's the beginning of the R&D process for a new ground combat vehicle, which is ultimately, if we're lucky, going to cost $40 billion, and that's a very heavy mechanized thing. When you look out in the future in terms of how you meet the challenges with all of the budget constraints that we have and how we have to choose between risk, and I guess my one difference from some on the committee is I don't think it's the job of this committee or your job to eliminate all risk. Can't do that. We have to sort of manage the threats. We have to do triage, try to contain the threats and be most logical about what is coming. When you're being most logical about what is coming, I think Secretary Gates is spot on in what he said at West Point. So, how does that blend in with continuing to build a heavier mechanized force with things like the ground combat vehicle? General?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I don't see the ground combat vehicle as a heavy mechanized vehicle. It may wind up being heavy because it requires a certain weight to protect soldiers from the blast. But we are purposely designing it as a full spectrum vehicle, one that can be used in any environment that we go into. and it is not specifically designed to fight mobile armored warfare, which is what the tanks and Bradleys are very well designed to do. This is the first vehicle that has been designed from the ground up to operate in an IED environment, and we believe that IEDs are going to be part of any future environment that we're going to have to operate in. So I don't see it as a heavy combat vehicle. I see it as a full spectrum vehicle that will protect our soldiers and connect them to the network.
Thank you, gentlemen, both very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your service. Secretary McHugh, I continue to be concerned that we spend billions of dollars on weapons systems only to change the underlying requirement and terminate the program. While termination may be appropriate in certain instances, we must examine how these requirements get validated in the first place. The Secretary of Defense coined a new phrase when he referred to programs as having exquisite requirements. Yet these requirements were approved at the individual service level and validated by the joint community. I read with interest a recent article which stated that you had commissioned an acquisition reform study last May. According to the article, the study group concluded that canceled Army programs had eaten up between $3 billion and $4 billion a year since 2004, and that, and this is a quote, "the Army lacks a creditable quantitative model and process for determining realistic, achievable requirements for modernization and recapitalization given reduced budgets," end quote. I understand a copy of the study was recently delivered to our committee. Can you share any of your observations from this study or follow-on actions? Do all of the weapons programs that are funded in this budget have valid requirements, or in 3 to 4 years will they be labeled exquisite?
Well, I think the Secretary has been very clear in his perspective as to what he is looking for out of the services in fielding a new platform. And as you mentioned, Congressman Bartlett, he feels, and I couldn't agree more, that the objective of single service, exquisite 100% meeting of requirements, it can no longer be the standard by which we field platforms, and that we have to be more realistic. And I would certainly tip my hat to the Chief. One of the first things he started talking to me about when I walked into the Pentagon as a new Service Secretary was the fact that our requirements process simply does not reflect reality, that it just ends up being an add-on, every little bell and whistle that you can think of, and the result, as you mentioned, found in the acquisition study is loss of billions of dollars and through canceled programs, the vast majority of which since 2004, of course, were through the Future Combat Systems cancellation. I'd like to think we've learned that lesson. I wouldn't come here today and tell you we can't do better, because we can, but to use for an example the ground combat vehicle, when that RFP was first put out on the street, it had over 900 exquisite requirements embedded in it. We had at least the good sense to pull back from that, to cancel that RFP, to revalidate the requirements, and they were reduced to less than 200, and the RFP was refielded. I think that beyond common sense, though, we have to have systems changes, and the report by Lou Wagner and Gil Decker that you had mentioned is going to be, at least in large measure, our blueprint. I don't want to prejudice our acquisition executive or our deputy undersecretary, because I just tasked them last week to look at that and to analyze it, but I've reviewed this report very carefully. I think it lays out in large measure a very common sense approach on both requirements and how we can be better acquirers of future platforms, and I look forward to working with the other executives in the Army to make sure that that happens. But I'd like to hear the Chief's comments, if that meets with your approval.
Now, Congressman, as I said in my opening statement, we're committed to using the resources you give us as effectively and as efficiently as possible. And as we look at what's happening with the budgets, there's no way that we can operate an acquisition system that doesn't very efficiently acquire the systems that give us the most value. And we're absolutely committed to doing that. Our track record, as you know better than I, has not been good at this. And what the report found, one of the things the report found was that our requirements and acquisition core competencies have atrophied over the last couple of decades, and we got to build those back. And it's going to take us a little time, but we're absolutely committed to doing it.
Thank you. I think all of us want the very best equipment for our people, and I think the challenge is to be able to develop a more open architecture so that the system, the platform can continue to be improved as it is in use. To have everything on the front end just makes it prohibitively expensive and too long a development time. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both. Good to see you here this morning. And General Casey, I want to congratulate you and thank you for your 40 years of service, including your wonderful wife, Sheila. Thank you both for serving our nation. I wanted to follow up on the ranking member's question regarding the Secretary Gates' speech at West Point. In that speech, he was questioning the Army's heavy mechanized forces, while at the same time saying that the Army should not be a constabulary peacekeeping force that can only do counterinsurgency, which I found curious because I think historically there's never been a closer working relationship between our military and our intelligence forces as we've taken on the challenge of Iraq and Afghanistan, and as we prepare to face the future challenges of not so much nations, although they'll always be on our radar scope, but these groups, these radicalized groups that work everywhere from the Middle East to the Horn of Africa and other places. To me, the Secretary's comments send a very mixed message, and I was curious to know what is your view of the Army's role in future combats? How does the Army strike the right balance between the different types of warfare that it may face, including in partnership with the intelligence community? And as you and I have talked about before, you know, the answer isn't we have to be prepared to do everything, because that makes it, you know, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So do you feel like you've had enough guidance from the civilian DoD leaders to make the kinds of choices the Army needs to make in the structure of the forces? And if not, your successor is going to have to work with this. How do you think that will take place? What will that look like, and what kind of specific guidance will your successor need to be able to carry out what I think is a kind of conflictive priority?
Thank you, Congressman. You know, lots of different reporting on the Secretary's speech, and what I found is if you sat down and read the speech, you had a different view than you usually got from the press reports of the speech. What I saw the Secretary doing was telling us to start thinking about the future beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think that's the right thing to do, and we have been doing that already. You've heard me talk about we're at war. It's a long-term ideological struggle, and that the trends out there in the global environment are more likely to exacerbate that struggle than they are to ameliorate it. And when I put all that together, I see us as a country in an era of what I call persistent conflict, protracted confrontation, and not necessarily at the level we've been at in Iraq and Afghanistan, but at some level, and I say for a decade or so. And we don't have a choice. I fought these folks in Iraq. They have a 100-year view, and they're out to attack our way of life. and establish their own. So, we have to be very careful with that. As we looked at this, the two elements of the future strategic environment that are most pronounced to us are uncertainty and complexity. And Secretary Gates hit it exactly right. Our record's perfect. We never accurately predict the future. So it seems to us that versatility needs to be the primary operating principle for our Army. We need a versatile Army for the future that can do a range of things, because we just don't know which end of the spectrum we're going to be operating at. And as we look at that, we say then, okay, well, we need a versatile mix of forces: heavy, light, special operating, striker, aviation brigades, and all the supporting forces. And we have been working for the last 6 months, going back and looking at every type of force and the design of every unit, to take the lessons that we've learned in the last decade at war and say, have we got this right? And, even though since 2003, we've stood down 40% of our heavy brigade combat teams, we've stood down almost 70% of our artillery units, and we've stood down about 60% of the heavy sustainment units that supported those forces. I mean, that's pretty significant. But we're also asking ourselves the question, was it enough? And so we're wrapping up the study here in the next few weeks, and I think my successor will be well postured to take a look and figure out what this Army needs to look like 2015 and beyond. And I think that's important. And I think that's where Secretary Gates is trying to push us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. I want to talk about a different part of the Secretary's speech last week. Caught my attention primarily because this is something I've been interested and concerned about for some time. He said that the third and greatest challenge facing the Army, and frankly my main worry, is how can the Army break up the institutional concrete, its bureaucratic rigidity in its assignments and promotion process. And I'm sure you both know that he went on to talk about a more merit-based, more individualized approach to officer evaluations, cited General Corelli's proposal that evaluations include input from peers as well as subordinates rather than just superiors. He talked about maybe instead of moving people around every 2 or 3 years, we ought to have people apply for job openings, like in the competitive system that a number of big organizations use. And essentially quoted Nagel and Yingling about the Army will become more adaptive only when being adapted offers the surest path to promotion. And so I think that really gets at the heart of not just budgets, but the culture of the Army. And my question is, number one, do you think he's right? That's the number one concern that we ought to have for the Army. And if you do think he's right, what are we doing about it?
Well, I would never say the Secretary of Defense is necessarily wrong, and I would not here either, not just because he's the Secretary of Defense, but more to the point because I think he is right. When you're at war, it's tough to say what is the number one challenge, but the Secretary's comments were directed, I believe, over time. This is a critical aspect of how the Army is structured and how it maintains itself that we have to address. One of the first things I did when I walked in the building was to begin to look at and rewrite the memorandum of instructions. These are the qualities that are listed in paper as instructions to the promotion boards, what we're looking for, the kinds of things that the Secretary mentioned, creativity, trying to get our promotion boards not to think about lifting up officers simply because they checked the boxes that they had checked on their OERs when they were promoted. And that's a cultural change that is a challenge, but I think we can begin to see it. I would argue that the selection of the next Chief of Staff Marty Dempsey, should the Senate confirm him, is a great example of promoting someone who thinks outside the box. And it will serve as a great example, not just because it will help us to create the means by which we can achieve those kinds of new paradigms, but also because it sends the right message as to what kinds of officers ultimately succeed. At the end of the day, we have to look at this very carefully, and I think the Secretary has set the stage in an exciting way that will allow us to think in new ways about what do we value in an officer. I think one of the equally big challenges we face, and the Secretary mentioned this in his speech, is that as we take today's field-grade officers, these majors and others who are given so much autonomy, so much authority in theater, and bring them back into CONUS and put them into what oftentimes is a moribund garrison environment, how do we keep them from losing interest? And there's a variety of things we have to work very hard to ensure that this Army, forged through 10 years of war, so well equipped with creativity and intelligence and flexibility, is not lost in a garrison environment. And we're looking at that every day in the schoolhouses, and I won't tell you we have the answers yet, but I think the Secretary has posed a critical issue for us to take up and to hopefully deal with effectively, or we're going to lose the greatest Army, I think, the world's ever seen.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that. I agree that we need to make some significant advances in our personnel system. They've been up to their eyeballs just trying to man these units and get them into the fight properly manned. But we have some significant changes we need to make in our promotion and assignments policy, no question. I don't think that's a number one concern, certainly not my number one concern. What the Secretary just mentioned about retaining this generation of young combat seasoned leaders who understand the environment that we're operating in, that's my number one concern. And combating this slipping back into a garrison mindset that a lot of the old folks can't wait to get back to, you know, the good old days. And we've been talking about this since last summer, when I had all the 2- and 3-star commanders and their sergeants majors in for a training and leader development conference. And I warned them about this, because I saw it myself as a division commander in Europe. We brought units back from Kosovo. We'd have a sergeant that we'd let lead a patrol into the downtown Jelani in the middle of the night, and we wouldn't let him turn in a deadline report when he got back. And that's our bias. And that's my number one concern, and we can't let that happen.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, again for being before us today. There's so many questions that I would really like to have with you. I was speaking earlier to our former colleague about how we protect the industrial base, or how we get back to making things in America, and how we use the military for that. Transformation, how do we really get out of Iraq and Afghanistan? So many questions, but unfortunately, I really need to come back to an issue that, Mr. Secretary, you and I worked on this committee, because it's still bothering me and it's still out there. And we just had last week a lawsuit filed with respect to sexual assault in the military. And because really nobody else brings it up, I'm going to do that. You know, one of the things that I remember you said, Mr. Secretary, so firmly when we were working on trying to change, and we did, the UCMJ with respect to sexual assault, was a comment you made when you were the chairman of the Personnel Subcommittee, and you said, it's been 15 years and we've had 18 reports given to the Congress from the Pentagon about sexual assault. And we're sort of, a lot of things haven't changed. I know that they've changed in the way that you're trying to implement, but the fact of the matter is I get calls every single day about our military women being assaulted by our military men. And they get drummed out, and the guys get to stay in. I mean, this is their main complaint. So the task force in the 2009 December report for sexual assault in the military recommended that the secretaries of the military departments ensure that all commanders and senior enlisted leaders be actively involved in sexual assault prevention and response training and awareness programs. I would like to ask you, Secretary McHugh, what steps have you taken to engage General Casey, right next to you, on the subject of sexual assault in the service?
I want to make sure I understand your questions, Ms. Sanchez. What actions have I taken in respect to the issue or working with the Chief?
Working with the Chief. What is it from the top? How can you help us change this? I mean, I really don't want to get another report that says the same thing again. So I'd like to know how actively, how do you think we can change that? Now you're on the other side, you know, having to deal with this.
Right. Fair
How do we
question.
do this?
I view this problem very seriously, and I really view it from two different perspectives. The first is a cultural one. I can't imagine anything more contrary to the basic core values of being a member of the United States Army than sexually assaulting, abusing a fellow soldier, be it male or female, under any circumstances. And what we have tried to do through the formation of the SHARP program, Sexual Harassment Response Program, is to put into place a mechanism by which we can begin to change the perspective and the understanding, particularly of our younger soldiers, but all through the cadres, as to how volatile this is to Army core values. The main component of that SHARP effort is an initiative called I Am Strong, Intervene, Act, and Motivate, where we've placed in the schoolhouses at all levels of military education the fact that this is unacceptable, what the responsibilities of every soldier is in looking out for, protecting, reporting, and participating in getting this better under control. Obviously, as we saw last week, we have quite a long ways to go. I mentioned it to you in our discussions earlier. One of the more recent initiatives was to produce 2 training films that I brought here to this House and previewed for a number of members who were able to drop by and take a look at it. My impression was they felt it was very effective. We give this now to, as part of our training aids, to all of our NCOs, those soldiers that are with our troops, our younger troops particularly, that learn and look up to those soldiers, and we're going to continue that effort. The other is to ensure that we have the resources and the personnel available to get out there and to make a difference. When this program began, it was funded at about $10 million. It's been a 500% increase now, and with those monies we have hired 10 experts to go out and to train our trainers. They're experts in everything from sexual assaults to investigations to counseling to forensics to laboratory work. We have hired 15 investigators in addition to our base cadre to go out and to ensure that when a sexual assault occurs, we have the expertise to fully investigate. We have hired prosecutors. We have hired 35 additional lab technicians. The Army is the central lab for investigating all cases of sexual assault. And most importantly, we have placed into the Judge Advocate General schools a specialist in sexual assault, and we have 38 different programs through the JAG schools to ensure that every JAG officer coming out and ultimately going to every post camp and station that we have Army forces on understands the nuances of investigating and prosecuting sexual assault. So we're trying to take a holistic approach. Obviously, one case is too many. I do think we're making good progress. I meet quarterly with the SHARP representatives and the Chief, and we take a full briefing and try to ensure that we understand exactly the outcome of those programs. But this is something that troubles us very deeply. And as I started out, I'll close with something that is totally contrary to our core values.
Thank you.
I know my
Thank-
time is up. I'll have some more questions for the record to ask the General on that also. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
If I
Mr.
could
Jones.
just add just briefly to that, because I think it's important, Congresswoman. It's a leadership issue. Prevention of sexual assault is a leadership issue, and it's something that we, from the top down, have to force all the way down through our ranks. Secretary Guerin and I started a program in 2008 designed to change the culture of the Army, because as we assessed the programs we put in place in 2004, they were all focused on response and not prevention. And we recognized that until we changed the culture, we weren't going to be successful in the program. And that's what this program that the Secretary mentioned is designed to do. At the end of this month, we have our annual conference, and the Secretary and I are going to put the goal at zero sexual assaults.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and Secretary McHugh, it's good to see you as always, and General Casey, I join my colleagues here in thanking you for your years of service to our nation. I want to go back. Last week we had Secretary Gates testifying, and I might have misunderstood, but it seemed that he was saying that, before a significant drawdown, much must happen in Afghanistan, and probably we're looking more at the year 2016 before there's a substantial drawdown. After I read his comments that he made in West Point, General Casey, I have a very dear friend, gave him my word, I wouldn't use his name in a hearing on the floor, that you would know very well, and I hate playing that game, but you would, but I gave him my word. I emailed him about Secretary Gates' comments about large number of troops in the Middle East, Africa, wherever it might be. And this will lead to my question. I'm going to read you just a sentence that he emailed me back. He said, I have mixed feelings about the comments made by Secretary Gates. I think he is spot on regarding the commitment of large number of forces to conflicts in either Asia or the Middle East, but must qualify this statement with the thought that if the conflict is in our vital national interests, we must never be afraid to take action to protect those interests. This general, who is retired, agrees with me and the American people that Afghanistan is really not in our national interest. It might have been 10 years ago, but it's 10 years later. My comment to you, based on what I thought I heard from Secretary Gates, can you share with this committee what do you view as a realistic timeline for withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan? Before you answer, would you please, we have been hearing for 10 years from different leaders of our military that it's going to be critical to be able to train the Afghans to do the police work. It's going to be critical to train the Afghanistan people to be the soldiers. And, not you, sir, not Secretary McHugh, but I've been hearing that for 10 years, and I think 10 years later they ought to be trained. And here we go again with the Secretary of Defense indicating that the significant drawdown might not happen until 2014. And yet the President of the United States, I know he meant what he said at the time, was saying a significant drawdown could happen beginning in July of 2011. The American people want to know, what is the end point of this strategy? What can they see that will say to the American people, we have victory after victory after victory? So if you would share with me, if no one else cares, what you see as the timeline that we can significantly start bringing down our troops in Afghanistan.
Okay, Congressman, you're asking the wrong guy to make comments on policy.
Well, I'm just asking your opinion because soon you will be a retired hero of this country. So if you can, in a short period of time...
Then I can make all the comments on policy that I want.
Well, maybe we'll call you back then. I don't know. But we don't ever get a straight answer. Now, I'm not talking about you here, but we don't ever seem to get the straight answer about what we're trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. What can we say to the American people that are spending billions of dollars breaking our soldiers' backs and legs and killing them? What can we say to them looks like we can declare victory?
Okay, if I might just go back to your friend's comments there about not putting forces on the ground. I mean, one of the things that I've learned in 40 years is never say never.
I understand.
and especially in an environment as unpredictable as we're operating in. And so I would just take you back to the comments I made. We have to have a versatile mix of forces that can do a range of things, and we ought not seal off or put off any options. I can tell you, now to your question about when. I can tell you from my experience in Iraq, and I'm sure I've come to this committee and sat before this committee and said, we can't credibly hand off security in these countries until the local security forces can maintain domestic order and keep the terrorists out. Otherwise, our long-term mission wouldn't be successful. We just have to do it again. And one of the things I worry about as I look at the environment is safe havens. Countries or parts of countries where the local government can't or won't deny their country to terrorists. And this global extremist network has tried to attack us on our soil 3 times in the last year. And they're not going to stop, and they're not going to quit. So for us to have the ability to go in and stop that, or better yet, have the local security forces at a level that can prevent that, I think is the only way we're going to protect ourselves over the long haul.
Thank you. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you and your family for the sacrifices you made for our country and the honor with which you serve. And Mr. Secretary, we are so proud of you and the dignity and quality of your work at the Department of the Army. Thank you for what you're doing as well. I looked at the budget request for FY12 as compared to the request for FY11. I wish I could say as compared to the budget for FY11. We're trying. And I see that there's about a $29.5 billion reduction FY12 compared to the request for FY11. I also see that $23 billion of that 29 approximately is from the O&M account and procurement account. To what extent is that drawdown, that reduction, attributable to the drawdown in Iraq? Either of you.
The theater operation differences between 11 and 12 are in large measure the cause of those drawdowns. There's a number of sub-factors. For example, a rather noticeable cut in warrior transition units that comes from OPA, Other Procurement Army, where we had a number of military construction projects underway to serve in the WTU inventory. The IT purchases have been made, and we no longer need that level of expenditure. But clearly, as we draw out of Iraq, as the expenses associated with personnel while deployed, 42 cents of every dollar we spend is personnel related, and the infrastructure that had been supported, we're down to 73 bases or posts in Iraq. More than 400 have been turned back to the Iraqis or just closed up. We no longer have to support. So a large measure of that is theater driven.
Mr. Secretary, could you tell us on what the size of the force assumptions are for the FY12 numbers, size of the force in Iraq assumptions? In other words, what are they based on?
The assumption is, as we are now at 500,000, and the planning assumption and our operational assumption is we will be out of Iraq in entirety by the end of this calendar year.
So am I correct that the present size of force is a little bit in excess of 40,000 Army? Is that correct?
50,000 roughly.
50,000.
We have 6 advise and assist brigades and an advise and assist task force.
And the assumption is at the end of FY12 or the end of calendar 11?
Calendar 11.
At the end of calendar 11, it's down to 0.
Sir.
Okay. I also wanted to ask about the reports in today's newspaper about a step up of fitness standards. What was, I applaud that. Sounds like it makes an awful lot of sense. If either of you could tell us what was the cause of that decision?
Well, it's something that we've been working on for a long time, and the last test was 30 years old, and we've been working at this for a while, and it finally, we got to the point where we had some concrete ideas and put it in a package, and now we're going to pilot it at several installations. But it's designed to test the things that we see ourselves using.
I don't expect you have a specific number, but do you know an intelligent estimate of what percentage of those who attempt to enlist are obese or significantly overweight?
75% of the age-eligible population of this country are either through weight, social background, criminal background, or intelligence levels unavailable for conscript for being accessed in the United States Army. And of that 75%, a very substantial number is because of obesity problems.
So I assume if we could do a better job in the civilian world in diet, nutrition, exercise, that the number of men and women eligible to serve would expand pretty significantly.
I think that's a fair assumption, sir.
And I see that you did a great job at 101% of your recruiting goals for this year, which is extraordinary given the circumstances. How much easier would it be to hit those recruiting goals if we had more people who are physically eligible to serve?
I think our recruiting command and its cadre would be delighted. But they do a great job, and it's not just numbers. The quality of our recruits is outstanding. Over 98% are high school grads. That's far in excess of the population averages in this country. And their intelligence levels are really unequaled in our Army's history.
We agree, and please thank them all, and we thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next will be Mr. Forbes, and at the conclusion of his questions, we will take a 5-minute break for the committee. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary in general, you know the enormous respect you have at this committee. Mr. Secretary, you've sat on this side, so you know our needs. In general, I don't know of any individual in the military who spends more time trying to talk with members and find out their concerns than you do. So I have two questions for you. One is that it seems like over and over when we have people coming in to testify to us today, we are hearing them say we're trying to give you a defense strategy that's driven by physical realities. When we hear that, it seems like we're saying there's this tension between what our defense needs are and what our budgetary wants are. The first question I would have is, do you have any recommendations for us as members of this committee about how we can be assured that we're getting the true defensive needs of the country that are not distorted by budgetary wants? That's one. And the second one, it seems like we're needing to use modeling and simulation a lot today for training, also for our testing and for jointness. How important do you see modeling and simulation in the Army, and what kind of future do you see for modeling and simulation?
I think many of us have been through the times, as I mentioned earlier, where we had a very significant mismatch between what the national defense policy was and what the services were fielding. And from my experience, I think we all intuitively knew it, but didn't press it. I sat through my first drawing up from the DoD side of the quadrennial defense review. And as I understand it, this was a landmark QDR in that it really did, for the first time, make an effort to purposefully match available resources against the formulation of that defense policy. And I wished I were better attuned to the QDR, both as a process and a document, when I was a member of this committee. And I think every member would find that helpful, because it either exposes the validity of what the national defense policy is and ultimately the resourcing of the individual services, or the gaps that exist that you can discern from those. So my humble suggestion was, read the QDR, be familiar with the process, and you can learn from it. I would say, with respect to the 12 budget, because I am mindful of the very circumstances that you spoke about, Congressman Forbes, that I look at this budget as really driven by policy, driven by what we expect the threat to be particularly in the out years. I mentioned we can never get it right, but as we look at the drawdown in Iraq, that we've already drawn down to just under 50,000 troops, as we look at what the President has said with respect to the drawdown as anticipated in Afghanistan, particularly beginning in 2014, and as the Secretary of Defense and the Chief worked out in their conversations, this budget fields an Army, again, critically important, that isn't just sufficient in numbers, but is robust in the equipment that is available to it, the training and program support initiatives for their families that we all know is so important in this volunteer force. But at all times, this committee plays a critical role to make sure that the services are getting it right, and we don't just look to you, we need you to keep close watch and vigilance, and that's why, in my opinion, this is such a great committee. Simulation, absolutely essential. We do a great job in trying to give soldiers real-world experiences. If you go out to the Chairman's district, the National Training Center, a little place called Medina Wassel, the replication of IEDs in a firefight in a simulated village, either in Iraq or Afghanistan, is chilling. But clearly, simulations, computer-driven and such, are some of the best ways we can ensure that our soldiers are acclimated to what they're going to see and what they're going to experience once they get into theater. And I see it as robotics and such get better and better, I see it as an increasingly important part of our training laydown.
Congressman, I just say that we're at war, and I can't imagine that you would ever have anyone wearing this uniform sitting in this position not coming to you and telling you what the men and women of the United States Army needed to successfully prosecute that war and recover from it. And that really was the theme of my opening testimony, that we have to be very, very careful here as fiscal pressures cause us to make decisions about the size, the structure, the equipment, the training for your future Army. We've been at war for a decade. It took us a decade to get where we are today, and we can unhinge that in a couple of years.
The committee will now stand in recess for 5 minutes and reconvene at 10 minutes to 12. Thank you. Committee will be in order. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to General Casey, I think that we are all grateful for your service, the country as our troops are and their families, and I want to thank you very much for always being available as well. And Secretary, Mr. Secretary, good to see you as well. I wanted to follow up just very briefly on the issue that my colleague Congresswoman Sanchez raised, because we do meet with victims quite frequently, actually. And I think the one message that I would relay from them is that until the perpetrators are held accountable and not promoted, nothing is going to change. All the education in the world is not going to make a difference. So it's the law enforcement piece that is really critical here, and I think we need to continue to work on that. I appreciate, and I know you've been working on it. Thank you. The other issue that I wanted to raise that a number of colleagues have mentioned is really the contracting issue. And I don't know whether you happen to see the CQ article in the middle of this month, and we're very aware of these issues ongoing, but it feels as if, in addition to the Army acquisition review that's going on, the fact that we've hired a number more corpsmen to deal with the procurement, that there's also a real cultural issue there in the way that contracts are let. And I wanted to ask you, General, because the Secretary spoke to this, I mean, you've seen a lot of this. I can't imagine, but this is not so frustrating from time to time, because this is all about the troops. It's about their equipment. It's about the way that we train. And a lot of the contracts that we know go on forever and don't have the kind of oversight that they should. How is this going to be different? How do we change business as usual?
Congresswoman, I'd come at this from two perspectives. One is the actual skills required to develop and monitor contracting. And you may recall back in 2007, the Army chartered what we call it the Gansler Commission. Jack Gansler went out, and we told him the same thing we basically told Lou Wagner and Gil Decker about the acquisition. Go out and give us a soup-to-nuts look at how we're doing contracting and tell us what we need to do to fix it. And he came back and gave us a blueprint. And when we looked at it, it's getting the right leadership. You know, we've promoted 15 acquisition and contracting colonels to general in the time that I've been here. And that is putting people in the right rank in leadership positions that have the knowledge to deal with these things. We also have stood up a contracting command and 7 expeditionary contracting brigades to provide the oversight. You might remember the charts where we started off with a couple of $100 million worth of contracts in Kuwait and went to $5 billion and did increase the people monitoring the contract.
I think partly what I'm asking, though, are sole source contracts. You know, maybe it's hard to generalize about, is that a good idea, is it a bad idea, data rights. I mean, do you think those issues are going to be changed? And what would you change?
Yeah. Well, some of those issues are really a case-by-case basis, and there's not a cookie cutter to say yes or no on any one of those. The other thing, though, on contracting is how we actually develop the requirements and the proposals to go out and buy something for the troops. And that's what the second study looked at. And it comes down to you got to have the right people with the right skills, and that takes time to build them. And so I think we're going in the right direction. I think it's going to take us some time to get where we want to be.
May I say just a couple of things about sole source? As the Chief said, there are circumstances where you have no choice. And in those circumstances, they're obviously an operational necessity. But they're few and far between, or they should be. And I think your point is well taken, that you don't have to look in the far past, the too distant past, to see where sole source contracts may have been let as a matter of convenience, not as a matter of responsibility. Probably the most prevalent example of areas where the Army and others have been criticized are in the log cap contracts, those service support contracts, and principally in Iraq, that over time in the past were sole sourced. We have changed that. They're now competitively let. We have 3, in fact, log cap operators in log cap 4. We have the issue recently of so-called ANC, Alaska Native Corporation contracts, where under the federal guidelines, an Alaska Native Corporation duly constituted is eligible for a sole source contract. That was a topic of some discussion in recent newspaper articles. We have put out directives that if we indeed use those kinds of contracts, they have to be absolutely justifiable. We don't want to diminish our support of the small business and minority objectives.
Exactly.
This administration is very supportive of those, but I think we've got to be wise taxpayer stewards, and sole sourcing is something that we can do a better job on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit questions for the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Casey, Secretary McHugh, thank you very much for your visits to Fort Jackson that I am very grateful to represent in South Carolina. To me, it's a classic case of where new recruits are trained, military opportunity is provided, and military service where young people can achieve to their highest potential. And so I appreciate your service. And my perspective, my dad served in the 14th Army Air Corps, Flying Tigers, World War II. I was grateful, General, to serve, actually beginning with you at Indiantown Gap Military Reservation, Pennsylvania, several years ago, like 43. And so I served 31 years in Guard and Reserve, but I'm most grateful I've got 3 sons currently in your command, serving with the Army National Guard, and one son served for a year in Iraq, another has served in Egypt, and the third guy will be commissioned May 12th. With that background, I want to thank you. This committee has been bipartisan, and I sent a letter with Congresswoman Davis, and General, you responded. I appreciate this. Our concern was well-timed, that the goal is still 1 to 3. And I'm still hopeful, too, that boots on the ground, that we can work for 1 year to 9 months. But my concern is about the drawdown and the impact of 27,000 drawdown. I'm concerned, obviously, for the morale of the troops, for the families, their concerns and expectations of a career that could be in jeopardy. I'm also concerned that we may have an unintended message to our enemy that we're not understanding the threat to our country. And so as to the impact, General, what do you see as to what study and what will be considered for a drawdown?
Thank you, Congressman. As we've worked our way through this, I mean, there was a reason I picked the end of 2014 to hold our end strength and access to the Guard and Reserve. And the reason was that got us through one full cycle at 1 year out, 2 years back. And I felt that that was important to get that for the troops. As we talked about earlier, we have not yet begun to figure out how this drawdown will occur. I mentioned that we've had an ongoing, some ongoing work for about 6 months here, looking at our force structure, figuring out what we need more of, what we need less of, those kinds of things. And that work will come together here, I would think, over the next 90 days to 180 days. And so I think we'll be in a much better position to talk about that a little bit later. But I would assure you and the committee that we will work very closely with the committee, and we want to make sure, because we're at war, we have an appropriate end strength that both meets the demand and does it at a sustainable tempo. I can't imagine knowingly bringing to this committee an end strength that wouldn't give us at least 1 to 2. And we want to get to 1 to 3 and be able to surge to 1 to 2. That's got to be the new benchmark. We can't go back to 1 to 1 after a decade at war.
And that would just be what I would support. So I thank you for your commitment. Additionally, General, all the Joint Chiefs signed a letter supporting changes in military health care plan. And these changes affect the military, but they also go beyond that and affect local hospitals such as Fort Drum, New York, Fort Huachuca, and Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona. How will these hospitals be affected?
If I may, in my own district, you mentioned one of the hospitals. When that special program was set up, the original intention, as I recall, was to ensure that these hospitals had the opportunity to adapt to the needs of the military community, and the assistance dollars were intended to provide that bridging opportunity. If I could use the hospital outside of Fort Drum, New York, and Carthage, New York, as an example, at the time, their OBGYN operations were probably not at a level that would allow them to take advantage and participate, particularly in live birth deliveries for the Fort population. And we would hope the monies provided gave them that chance to upgrade their infrastructure. From my perspective, it was never intended to be an unending program. And in fact, it's been maintained now for a sufficient amount of time that the Department of Defense made the judgment that indeed we could withdraw that support and that the bridging should have been completed by now. I can't speak to the condition of each and every hospital, but I think from a programmatic level, it was a reasonable planning and budgetary assumption. I just want to point out, when we're talking about the very modest increases to the TRICARE payments, they do not affect active military. No active military member nor their families would be affected by the very modest increases in the TRICARE enrollment increases, which are $2.50 a month for an individual and $5 for a family.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kissel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Good to see you again. And General Casey, we also wish you the best. And if you could pass on to your wife also that our thanks for her service. I know you and I were at a meeting last spring. We were both there in service of our spouses who were in service of our military families and especially our military children in light of education. Our concerns here, my concerns, is for the whole of the military, the whole of the Army, and the reserve component. I'm going to zero in a little bit towards Fort Bragg, the center of the universe, and General Mulholland and Special Forces. I'm sure there's one or two people here who might be familiar with Robin Sage and the exercise that our Special Forces go through, and as they train to go into the field, and they tell us it's the best training they get to actually be working in counterinsurgency. And I've had the privilege, because Robin Sage is mostly my district, I've had the privilege of being a character actor there 3 times. I've been the Pineland government official who will work with the insurgency, and it's been a great opportunity. But if you could tell us a little bit about the Special Forces. I know Admiral Olson was talking about the Special Ops. They're starting to feel a little bit of the strain. What's our Special Forces doing, where we're heading, and what's our plans for Special Forces?
Well, we've been adding a Special Forces battalion a year here for the last several years, and I think we finish up next year. And it'll be a total of 5 more Special Forces battalions that we've added to the force. And I talk to General Mulholland frequently, and he has done a wonderful job of putting us in a position to better support them. I know you've heard a lot about talk about enablers for Special Forces. We've worked out a system where they can request enablers from us through the normal force generation process that I described earlier, and that's helping them out quite a bit. I think one of the other things that we're looking at here, and I've discussed this with both General Mulholland and Admiral Olson, is that we're looking, because of our experience with conventional forces working with other militaries that we've gained in the last 5 or 6 years, we're actually going to be in a position here next year to start taking some of the training requirements to ease the burden on the Special Forces. And so that active conventional mix can go, active special mix can go the other way, and actually we can wind up supporting them. The other thing that we're doing is for Special Forces Aviation, building them some additional CH-47 battalions so that they increase their aviation capabilities.
Thank you, sir. And I would just like to quickly reiterate what my colleague Ms. Davis said about the concerns about some of the, and that y'all have talked about and are working on, is some of the procurement down to some of the smaller levels of contracts. I'm not talking about the big systems and the big monies, but just some of the things that people have that are better ideas, better costs. It just seems like the bureaucracy, that there's such a comfort level of the people within the programs that they don't want to be bothered with having to consider something else. And we get a lot of folks that we feel that have good ideas that just get frustrated with the process. We appreciate y'all working on this, and I will actually be sending a couple questions in for off the record. And thank you for your service, and thank you for your time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you for being here. Mr. Secretary, good to see you again. I appreciate you being here. And I, for one, do miss you on the committee. So for all those who are happy that you're in that position, I certainly appreciate all the accomplishments that you had while you served on this committee. General, you had made the point that we are a country at war. And this is a Congress that is burdened by the issues of how do we address this mounting debt and the deficits that our country is facing. But I think we know, being a country at war, that our greatest concern is how do we ensure the Department of Defense receives what it needs at the same time that we do look for efficiencies. And one of the concerns that I have as we look to the issues of reductions or cost cutting in the Department of Defense, obviously, is the issue of in-strength reductions, both those that are looked at the Marine Corps and the Army. And in your opening statement, you made reference to the issues of dwell time ratios. We know that the Marine Corps and the Army neither have met the goal of 1 to 3 dwell time ratios. According to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs' testimony to the committee on February 16th, the Army will not even achieve a 1-to-2 dwell ratio until sometime in 2012. You made similar statements of the goals of achieving it. But they are still just goals, and we have grave concerns as we look to what reductions and resources that you might have as to whether or not that is accomplishable. And then, so if you would comment on that, I would greatly appreciate it. And then, Mr. Secretary and General Casey, I'm also interested in your thoughts on the issues of Humvee reprogramming. I think people are really concerned as to what extent there has been true and accurate analysis of both the ability to field the type of vehicles that are needed and to look at what the effects are going to be of the account reprogramming. And I would appreciate if you would comment on that, and I probably have a follow-on question to the Humvee comments.
If I may, I'll start with Humvees, and then if the chief would take over on end strength. The issue of how carefully did we consider this is a well-studied one, and I can assure you this is based on sound analysis. I directed early on in my tenure as the Secretary that the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Pete Corelli, and the Undersecretary of the Army, Joe Westfall, begin what we're calling capability portfolio reviews. Everything the Army does is compressed into a portfolio, whether it be our wheeled vehicles, our combat fighting fleet, et cetera, et cetera. And when that panel took a look at Humvees, they discovered something very, very interesting. Not only had we met our requirement, we in fact had exceeded it. And we had come to the point where we always knew someday we would be, that is, our acquisition objective had been achieved. There's a couple of reasons that snuck up on us. I think in large measure because the Humvees were not being used to the extent we thought they would be in theater, they were lasting longer. And we weren't having to transition out through wear as many as I think in the first instance were programmed. The other thing is the commanders were concerned about their survivability in an IED environment, so that too added to the fact that we had more on hand much, much sooner than we had originally planned. So that analysis led us to the conclusion that the monies that were scheduled in 2010 to procure more Humvees could be better spent in other ways. And we worked with the Secretary of Defense and Comptroller Hale to ensure that the proposed reprogramming we put forward would utilize the monies, should the Congress approve that reprogramming, to meet the immediate threat that our soldiers are facing in theater. Counter-IED, ISR, things that are necessary to save lives. So it's a very careful calculation. We feel it's well-founded in the data, and obviously a change of this nature causes concern amongst some quarters. We understand that, and we're willing to do whatever we can.
If I could, Mr. Secretary, before my time completely runs out, but I appreciate your answer and your explanation. Two concerns. Obviously, in that switch, you're taking a capital expenditure and shifting it to what is an operational expense. The other issue is the concern that the JLTV program may be delayed, and what problems will result if that program is delayed? Will you be able to meet all of your requirements?
The question, your second question is we will. We have a recap program for the existing Humvee that is being damaged right now, frankly, by the continuing CR. We've had to lay off of 200 at Red River and Letterkenny on that recap program. But we feel we can buy a 0 miles based, 0 hour based recapped Humvee for $100,000 versus $165,000 for an equal new. So we feel confident, and we're going to acquire platforms with our reprogramming. As I said, counter-ID is such. In the same fashion, we're going to require Humvee platforms.
Thank you. Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, like my colleagues, would like to thank General Casey for his 40-plus years of service, and to say that I've read a lot about you, and I think we are losing someone with amazing foresight as to what we need to do. Having said that, my questions are for the Secretary. Mr. Secretary, in looking at the budget, it's very evident that the base budget for the 2012 request is about 144 plus almost $145 billion. And there is this interesting category called, of course, the Overseas Contingency Operation, the OCO, which then amounts to almost 50% of the 144. So for your total addition together, you'd have about $216 billion. I'm very interested in the OCO category because my understanding from the prior briefings is that that category is really one that's sort of tied to Iraq and Afghanistan. And as we begin to draw down, I assume that that budget was also being looked upon as being drawn down. Now, how will that then impact what you need to do with your sustainability efforts for the Army in the future?
Well, indeed, the OCO budgets, it used to be called supplemental budgets, are designed to support theater operations. That is how historically Congress has funded wars, and it provides us an opportunity to fund, as you noted, a base budget this year just over $140 billion to sustain those things that we would buy whether we were at war or not, and at the same time to ensure we're doing the right things by the warfighters. Indeed, as you noted, Congresswoman, OCO budgets do come down when theater operations and demands decrease. The $71 billion in this year's Army OCO request is down from about $120 in years past, and we expect that that will continue as operations diminish. We will need, in terms of our long-term sustainment, as the Chief had mentioned earlier, 2 to 3 years of reset monies, those dollars that are in large measure, in fact, totally contained in OCO right now, to bring back the major pieces of equipment, to put them through the recap program, to bring them back to standards for 2 to 3 years after we're no longer engaged in a named contingency. So we need those reset monies as they're contained in MOCO right now to transition with Congress's support into the base, so we can do over the next 2 or 3 years after cessation of hostilities the reset program that we need.
I noticed that also part of the OCO budget is an increase of $9 billion for research and development and about $2.1 billion for procurement. I happen to be a great advocate of research and development, and I was wondering, why is it in the OCO budget? Was there something unique about this research and development and the procurement that puts it in the OCO budget versus something that can be facilitated in the base budget?
I don't recall that exact line, but clearly, if you look, for example, historically at joint IED defeat programs, the RDT&E had been in the OCO. I would note that we are purposely, and I think at the behest and urging of the Congress and this committee, moving those funds for IED defeat, providing a line in the base budget for that. But a generic response to your question would be any time we are developing something such as an MRAP or something that is field unique, it would not be unusual to have at least a portion of the research development monies in the OCO itself, because that's a primarily war-driven process and cost.
Let me ask you about one of the probably the most disturbing parts of the testimony regarding General Chiarelli's report on the suicide. Now, how much of the reset or how much of this dwell time is going to cost? It's going to have a cost. And how much of that should we really have in the base budget if it isn't already in the base budget? It seems to be something that is so a result of the OCO operation. So wouldn't we want to ensure into the future that we have those kinds of costs written into your base?
Well, we pay a soldier, whether that soldier is back in reset and going through R4Gen and his or her home base, or if they're forward deployed. When they're forward deployed, there are certain wartime pays and bonuses that are available, but the cost when you are in CONUS and garrison are calculated as part of our personnel expenses. As I mentioned earlier, about 42 cents of every dollar we spend are personnel driven, and it's something that we'll have to build into our budget development process. And we do that routinely.
Thank you.
If I could, we are already putting some of those costs in the base. I mean, we have about $280 million in the base for psychiatric care and services, and another $85 million for research in post-traumatic stress and mild traumatic brain injury. That's already in the base.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Casey, may I just add my name to the list of all those who have lauded your noble service to humanity and just to the cause of human freedom. I know that there's no way to express the kind of service that you've done. I mean, a lot of us talk about freedom up here, and people like yourselves carry it on your back everywhere you go, and I appreciate it so much. And Mr. Secretary, obviously it's wonderful to see you back again. You know, I don't know if it's harder on that side of the lectern or not. It sounds like it might be. So my question is to both of you. DOD has recently decided to stop funding for the Medium Extended Air Defense System, or the MEADS system, and yet they've decided to complete the design and development phase of the program, which requires an additional $804 million across fiscal 12 and 13. And as you know, the MEADS program is intended to replace the aging Patriot and Hawk missile systems, and has been developed in cooperation with, of course, Italy and Germany. Admiral Mullen testified in a hearing before the Senate in 2007 that, quote, "In view of the threats we face today and will face in the future, I believe the United States should deploy components of the ballistic missile defense system as soon as they become available, even as we improve their operational effectiveness," close quote. Now, significant amounts of time and research and development and testing have already gone into the MEADS system. And at a time when the need for a layered ballistic missile defense system is drastically increasing, I guess my question is kind of threefold. First, does it make sense to end a program that will meet this need so near to its completion? And secondly, if the program is terminated, what course of action is the Army taking to replace the intended mission of the MEADS system, and what kind of time frame are we working on? And finally, do we have a cost comparison between seeing the MEADS system go through to production and implementation and the alternative to replacing the Patriot and Hawk missile systems? That's a long set of questions, but it's...
I'll do my best to try to get through at least most of those. This was not an easy decision, and it wasn't a hasty decision. As I'm sure you're aware, Congressman, the MEADS program has been underway for a decade. The Army has invested over $2 billion, and that's only the partial cost of the program. Frankly, it was underperforming. You mentioned it was close to completion. We're not so sure that's true. The decision to stick with the D&D through the end of, I believe, 14 and reap the technology was one, to provide our German and Italian partners an equal opportunity to harvest technology out of that. If there's any available information and gain out of this program, it is the technology package. We intend to put that on the shelf and to utilize it in trying to develop a program that can deliver the capability that MEADS was designed to deliver, and do it in a more timely and affordable way. In the interim, it is our intention to do upgrades to the PAC-3 that you mentioned, to use Aegis and other layered defenses that OSD has validated to us are available to meet the near-term needs. We just felt it was more good money after bad, but we remain committed to a system that provides that kind of protection against a threat that is just not going to go away.
General, I might ask you to elaborate too. I mean, as far as the cost comparison to any replacement that may occur, you're saying to me, it sounds like that you think that PAC-3 and some of the other systems can be upgraded to be able to meet that need. Was that what I'm hearing?
I said as a bridge.
Okay. And where would the bridge go?
will the bridge go to the next system? We're not abandoning the project. And one of the reasons of harvesting the technology is as the threat becomes more prevalent, we can take the technology off the shelf and develop a system that meets the threat when it appears. Right now, it's prospective.
All right. Well, I guess I'm hearing a little conflict here that the threat or the need is increasing, but if I heard you right, Mr. Secretary, you're saying that the need right now is more prospective. Now, maybe I misunderstood.
Well, what I'm suggesting, and I defer to your expertise on missile defense, Mr. Franks. I've followed your lead on voting many times, and I appreciate the insight and the understanding you bring to that.
You should keep that a secret if you can.
No, there's not many of us here. Perhaps they'll hold it.
Nobody will know. You're safe. Yeah.
But we felt it was a wiser use of money, particularly with this program that was non-performing, and we really did not see light at the end of the tunnel, to invest the funds more wisely in an immediate threat that we know is out there, that we feel and has, as again I mentioned, validated by OSD and DOD, that can be met by our PAC-3 upgrade programs, Aegis, and other available technologies. Clearly, we need to ensure in the future, as this threat that MEADS was intended to confront matures, to have a response to it. And that's why we're harvesting the technology to begin to develop a new program that will meet what we feel is a maturing threat somewhere down the road. It's not a threat right now that we believe we're indefensible against.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and General, thank you. Let me beat this horse from a different side. It's going to cost about $800 million to finish MEADS to proof of concept. That's $800 and something million. The request to bring it this next FY12 is around $400 million, roughly half. If you're not doing it for any particular purpose that meets a standing threat, then why put the money there at all? My question is actually for General Casey. Do you have any other thing you would like to put the almost $500 million into in FY12 or yet?
No, but I mean, as you both know, I mean, this is a very complex program. It's a development program with other countries that have interest in it. There are cancellation fees and things that had to be taken into consideration. And the Department has worked all of those issues and come to the conclusion that this is the best way to proceed with the program.
By spending almost $1 billion on something we're not going to produce.
But that will allow us to meet our obligations to these other countries.
So we're doing it for these other nations' interest?
If I may, the $800 million proof of concept that you mentioned, we're not convinced is viable. The history of this program has been one, as it's been related to me, where milestones that were set out and determined were rarely reached in the time frame in which they were defined. And proof of concept may well be yet another one of those. The investment of the $400 million was, as the Chief said, a decision as to how do we most wisely terminate this program. If we withdrew this year, there are substantial withdrawal fees that the United States would have to bear and pay into the program that would not make it a wise decision.
Would you call it a bad deal then from the very beginning, kind of? I mean,
well, I think I wasn't there at the time, Congressman Hunter. Obviously, anytime you spend over $2 billion and dedicate a decade and you have little to show for it beyond the technology package, was why the Department decided to spend the $400 million, is probably not what you'd want to design your procurement programs to be. But I think in the beginning you had three key allies, the Germans, the Italians, the Americans, working together to try to do cooperatively something that maybe they wouldn't have taken up jointly. And for a variety of reasons that I don't pretend to totally understand, it has been a non-performing program.
Okay. Next question, something totally different, having to do with reserves, National Guard, Army drawdown, as we exit Iraq and hopefully victoriously leaving Afghanistan in the next decade or so. How are we going to make sure this time that we don't let our National Guard and reserves fall into disrepair, especially National Guard, which are your shooters? I mean, just the huge burden, I wouldn't call it a burden, I'd call it a privilege that they've had to serve as main frontline soldiers, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq. How are we going to make sure that they don't fall into the same slump that they seem to every time we exit a war?
That's a great question, because they have been full participants in this war. I mean, the Guard itself has over 600 killed, 5,000 wounded. And I just talked to all of the tags a couple of days ago, and we talked about exactly this. We all believe that we do not want the Guard and Reserve to go back to being just a strategic reserve. We've invested $28 billion just in Guard equipment in the last 5 years. We have to figure out how to leverage that investment. And we commissioned a study, the Secretary and I, about a year ago now, where we asked a former Chief of Staff of the Army, a former Chief of the Army Guard, and a former Chief of the Army Reserve to go back and tell us what should be the role of the Guard and Reserve in an era of persistent conflict when repeated deployments are the norm. And they came back and gave us some great insights. And one of the most important insights that they gave us was that we're going to have some forces that are going to deploy. And those forces will be resourced and to do what to be manned, trained, and equipped so they meet the needs of that deployment. And we have designed the Army since the early 70s not to be able to go to war without the Guard and Reserve. And I think you know our force structure is very heavily weighted with Guard and Reserve filling the combat support, combat service support functions. And so there's one level. They're going to get funded. They're going to go. Now the question then becomes, okay, how much readiness do you build in the next to deploy forces? And we need a model that allows us to sustain their combat edge that they've built over the last decade, but then also only to build the readiness we need when we need it. And we are actively working on that model with the Guard and Reserve, but we are absolutely committed that we don't want the Guard and Reserve to go back to being just a strategic reserve.
Great, and please let me know how we can help. Mr. Walls and myself are the co-chairs of the National Guard Reserve Caucus now, and any way that we can help you with that or work with you on that, we'd be happy to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary McHugh, and especially General Casey, seeing that you're going to retire soon. Thank you so much for your 4 decades of service to the United States Army. First of all, Secretary McHugh, share with you the condolences to the families that were killed in the Fort Hood shooting that happened last year. I'm sorry, in November 5th, 2009. And the report of Major Hassan is, I believe it's still restricted. And it's merely an analysis of his personnel record with no references to the incident itself. And if it is still restricted, I would ask you to make that available to the American people. I think they have a right to know, and I don't see anything relevant to national security nor relevant to the case that's in this report. It is, in fact, embarrassing to the United States Army to have missed so many, I think, cues as to the radicalization of Major Hassan, and I believe that corrective action is being taken in that regard. Certainly hope that it is. Secretary?
The release of information is really controlled by the interpretation placed on it by the legal authorities as to the possible effect it might have at this time with respect to public release with the prosecution for the crimes allegedly committed by Nidal Hassan. That was a decision made by the Office of General Counsel, DOD, and others, and at such time that I would assume that those circumstances no longer exist, release of appropriate redacted information, I feel comfortable will occur. I just can't tell you when the lawyers.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I just want to say that that is an abuse of the authority of the Chief Legal Counsel of the Department of Defense to have made that decision, which I believe is a political decision and really has nothing to do with the case. Let me go to a question concerning I believe we have 4 brigade combat teams still in Europe. And General Casey, I think you were a second lieutenant when I was a private in the United States Army. During the Cold War, and you and I know it's pretty damn cold being on that border, Czechoslovakian West German border, rotating on that border during that period of time in the early 1970s. Well, we still have 4 brigade combat teams there, and the Cold War has long since been over with. And I know in the the Quadrennial Defense Review, they supported keeping those troops there. But in a recent GAO study, it said that the GAO concludes in keeping 2 brigades in Germany costs $390 million more per year than basing them in the United States. And so I would really ask you to take a look at whether or not we ought to redeploy some of those forces back to the United States. Do you have a response to that?
I think, you know, Congressman, this is something the Department of Defense has been working on for a while, and I think they're getting relatively close to making a decision on what, if any, of those forces would return.
Very well, thank you. You know, my final question, in Secretary McHugh or General Casey, the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle program has been subject to cost overruns, milestone delays, ambiguous capability requirements. You know, I think that right now the projected base unit cost of the JLTV is $300,000 to $400,000 per copy. And you know, and I know, historically these costs will rise over time. What is the future of this program, and how will the Army manage cost increases? What is the long-term ground vehicle strategy for the Army regarding Humvees, MRAPs, and the JLTVs?
A big question there. The Army is still committed, and we're still working with the Marine Corps on the development of the JLTV. Your observations about cost overruns is accurate, and it in large measure goes back to what we had discussed earlier in this hearing with respect to unrealistic requirements. I think they've reconfigured that. We do expect a lot out of the JLTV. It shares several hundred requirements with the MATVs, with the mine-resistant MRAPs that we think are performing so magnificently. But it has its own unique aspects as well. We're trying our best to control that, and we look forward to its fielding. It will be ultimately the replacement for the Humvee with far more survivability, with off-road capability that the Humvee does not have, and we see it as part of our future fleet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. I've learned a great deal, and I want to thank you for your leadership. I also want to express my support and admiration for those you lead. And I think it was particularly noteworthy that you brought these fine non-commissioned officers here, remind us to keep it real as we're going through this here today. Thank you for your service. And we remember the families, too, and I thought it was very touching that you brought one of our Gold Star family leaders here today. We will always remember. You know, I also want to appreciate the work that went into preparing the budget. You know, this is really a different time over the last decade. We're doing more with less. We are all committed. I think everybody on this committee and beyond is committed to protecting our cherished way of life. But we also know that the deficit is a threat to our way of life. So towards that end, the judgment that you showed to deal with the declining President's budget's numbers is appreciated. You know, my comment and question has to do with the future of the armed forces, and here today the Army, and looking forward to 2014, 2015, and beyond, at a time when we have accomplished our objectives in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we think about the force that we're going to need. I affiliate to some degree with the SecDef said that any future Secretary of Defense would be crazy if he gave a recommendation that we send the Land Army or send our Army to the land forces in Asia or to Africa. I think to the degree that we avoid a decade-long counterinsurgency effort is something we ought to be trying to do. I think there are better ways to neutralize the al-Qaeda threat. But having said that, so much of the international order is really based on deterrence and the capability to have demonstrated capability to put together a CONOP where the nation has the ability from joint forcible entry to early entry to campaigning to sustaining and post-hostilities, I think will go a long way to keeping peace, particularly when you think about the instability in the world and the potential interests of nations that may want to take advantage of certain circumstances. So looking out in 14 and 15 and beyond, General, how do you assess our ability to conduct these kind of operations? Where do you think the risk is, not only inside your formations and your institution, but along the joint force for the country to be able to do this? And are you convinced that in the FIDEP we have wargaming exercises and other means to come to understanding and situation awareness on where our weakness and vulnerabilities are? Thanks.
Well, this kind of goes back to the discussion we were having earlier about what are we going to need and what kind of Army we're going to need in 2015, 2016. And as I mentioned, the two dominant characteristics of the future environment are uncertainty and complexity. And frankly, I believe that the Army we will have at the beginning of 2015 will be an Army that's versatile, that's combat seasoned, that's well-equipped, and ready to deal with a wide range of challenges. The issue will be, should we draw it down? And if we draw it down, can we do that without damaging our capability to operate across the spectrum of conflict, to put together the types of operations that you mentioned? Because I think that's what we're going to need. We don't know what we're going to be doing in 3 to 5 years from now. I mean, Secretary Gates says our track record is perfect. And I firmly believe that we'll be doing something in 3 to 5 years that none of us are thinking about today. I don't know what that is.
Are you convinced that in the FIDEP you've got the wargaming, the modeling, the simulation, the exercises to show that we have this capability? And for example, to put a finer point on a couple of these things, are you convinced we got enough C-17s, vessels, that we've got the command and control and the like, that we're going to be able to put this together?
Now, I appreciate what you're saying there, and there are studies and models that do the kinds of things you're saying. But what I've found in my 4 years here is they're still largely weighted toward a conventional military operation. And we've been working with others over time to build models that actually reflect the kinds of operations that we're going to be doing, that we think are hybrid-type operations. They're not, there'll be a mix of conventional, irregular, criminal, terrorists, all arrayed against us asymmetrically. But we don't have good models for those, to your point.
Well, thank you very much for that testimony. And I think to the degree that we demonstrate competency on that, I think it will reinforce what our diplomats are doing for us, and we'll be a stronger nation. And I think we can protect our cherished way of life in a manner that's consistent for a republic and not an empire. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I see no further members of the committee to ask questions. I thank you for your time here today. Thank you again for your service. Look forward to working with you as we move through the budget process, and this committee will stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith.
Good thing I didn't sneeze.